Okay, just a brief Italian introduction and then you can start in English. Allora, benvenuti a questa lezione della Scuola di Liberalismo. È una lezione particolare perché ovviamente è una lezione aperta, è aperta al pubblico, siamo anche nelle nostre dirette social e siamo molto contenti di avere qui oggi Kathleen Stock, che è ex professoressa di filosofia dell'Università del Sussex, poi scopriremo perché, molti di voi probabilmente sapranno la sua storia. Ha studiato filosofia presso dei prestigiosissimi atenei quali Oxford e St. Andrew. Ha conseguito un dottorato all'Università di Leeds, quindi la sua preparazione accademica è veramente, insomma, di rilievo. La docente è stata attaccata pubblicamente con una campagna d'odio molto forte a causa delle sue posizioni riguardo la gender identity e ce ne parlerà oggi riguardante proprio la relazione tra identità di genere e libertà di espressione. Per queste posizioni ideologiche è stata accusata pesantemente di essere transfoba, una femminista radicale. Dopo mesi di minacce e intimidazioni lei ha comunque dovuto ufficialmente lasciare l'università, costretta. Quindi diciamo che averla qui è particolarmente importante perché le dimissioni forzate della professoressa sono per la Fondazione Einaudi, ma dovrebbe essere così per tutti, rappresentano una sconfitta civile e ci obbligano sicuramente a porci dei quesiti. Ad esempio l'università dovrebbe essere il tempio del sapere, della libera discussione, della formazione, dello spirito critico, e invece in questo caso è stata una casa di intolleranza e di violenza. Questi episodi che la professoressa ha subito di squadrismo e diffamazione, avvenuti così apertamente, fanno molto riflettere anche su delle posizioni molto radicali che alcune minoranze hanno. Quindi è un piacere averla con noi, ascolteremo molto volentieri la sua lezione e lascio la parola direttamente alla professoressa, che è stata gentilissima a venire qui in Italia per essere qui con noi. So Kathleen, the floor is yours and I will show you the slide. Okay, great. Okay. Here we are.
So thank you very much for having me here. I'm very honored to be here, and thanks to the Fondazione Luigi Einaudi for having me. So gender identity and freedom of expression is my topic. How's it going? Okay, so I just want to start by reminding everybody of some basic facts that you might find surprising because you might think that they are absolutely banal, but they are in fact becoming more and more contested, particularly in certain countries, and including the UK. So I'm going to assume that human beings are a sexually dimorphic species. The males and the females contribute to sexual reproduction. They have different shaped gametes and they have different shaped bodies. And I'm also going to assume that males and females have different bodily capacities after puberty. So on average, males are larger, taller, stronger, faster than females. On average, males have greater upper body strength than females. Females can menstruate, get pregnant, give birth, breastfeed, and so on. So none of those are claims about all males or all females. They're not claims about what is essential to being a female. They are generalizations. Okay. I'm also going to assume that because of the facts of sexual reproduction, men and women are put in constant social contact with each other in nearly every society. And I'm also going to assume that when people talk about homosexuality or same-sex attraction, I'm a same-sex attracted female, for instance, it's same-sex attraction is attraction to biological sex. So homosexuality is attraction between someone of one sex and a relationship with their own sex. And heterosexuality is an attraction between people of the opposite sex. Now, those things seem very, very obvious and basic, but they have become controversial. I'm also going to assume that biological sex makes a difference to social life in all sorts of ways. For instance, when a woman gets pregnant, she cannot move around as she normally can, and that might make a difference to work and the work that she can do. Children in early life are very dependent physically on their mothers unless substitutes are given, and that will also affect work, which may affect pay. I'm going to assume that in situations of physical conflict between men and women, men have a physical advantage, and that puts women at risk, particularly in a society where most men are heterosexual and they might have a sexual interest in women. And in terms of sport, as you can see from this picture, I'm going to assume that there's very different body shapes involved in female sport and male sport, even at the top of their ability. So men can run faster than women, jump higher and longer. And in contact sports like rugby, for instance, then there's a risk to women if they are playing with men physically. So none of that implies what's called biological determinism. I'm not saying that the outcomes of men and women are necessitated or determined by their biology. I am just making basic, banal generalizations that have been not in dispute for centuries. I'm just saying that certain outcomes are made more likely. Of course, biology interacts with the social world, and the social world can then mitigate certain biological effects. So, liberal societies in the recent past have tried to mitigate social problems for women in particular caused by biology. So, for instance, some countries offer women maternity leave, paid. Some countries make it illegal for women to be discriminated against by employers. Some countries are very interested in gathering sex-specific data, so data about the different outcomes of men and women in certain situations, maybe sex-specific data in terms of medicine or education. And most societies have had sex-specific spaces where women and girls get undressed or sleep or are in some way vulnerable to potential attack from males. So that's why we have women-only, female-only bathrooms and changing rooms. And also we have sex-specific sports. You know, nearly every sporting practice differentiates between the men and the women with a few exceptions. Okay, so all of that is pretty uncontroversial, or was uncontroversial. Left liberal societies have also recently legally tried to protect gays and lesbians, understood as same-sex attracted people. So they have made sexual orientation a protected characteristic, for instance, in the UK's Equality Act. And some societies have allowed gay people to marry, to adopt, to have the same age of consent sexually as heterosexuals. Okay, so all of that is now in dispute because of this idea of gender identity, which you may, I don't know, I'm asking around while I'm here saying, is gender identity an important political concept here? It doesn't seem as if it is particularly important, but it's of huge importance in the UK, America, Canada, it's growing importance in France, in Germany, in Spain, for instance. So there's already dispute about what gender identity is. This is the definition given by a campaigning group called Stonewall in the UK. They say gender identity is a person's innate sense of their own gender, whether male, female, or something else, might be non-binary, which may or may not correspond to the sex assigned at birth. Okay, so that's a very bureaucratic kind of piece of language, but you might also hear people talking about identifying as a woman, having a female gender identity, identifying as a man, having a male gender identity, or identifying as non-binary, having a non-binary gender identity. So what does that mean? Right. Activists, LGBT activists, present gender identity as innate, as something that's kind of an essential part of you, permanent, probably, unless it's fluid, but then if it's fluid, it's permanently fluid. And it's presented as a fundamental part of who you are, contributing to your personhood, to your dignity. It's kind of often used, the language used is kind of Kantian in its idiom. And the traditional idea of being trans, being a transsexual or transgender, is also being altered by the idea of gender identity, because for, I think, most of the 20th century, the idea of a transsexual person was understood as someone who had particular surgery, had a medical condition, had perhaps a feeling of gender dysphoria, which is supposed to be a strong feeling of distress at your sexed body. And this distress would be so strong that they would then engage in very invasive surgery to make their body more like the opposite sex. That's all gone now. The idea is that to be trans, you just have a gender identity, an inner state that does not match your outer state. So if you have a incongruent gender identity that's incongruent with the facts about your sex, then that's enough to make you trans, according to this new narrative. You don't need to have surgery. You don't need to take cross-sex hormones. You don't need a doctor to tell you. You don't need a judge. You don't need any kind of bureaucratic or legal or medical kind of confirmation. It's your inside, your feelings that make you trans. So we get very popular in UK, this kind of graphic, which has gender identity up here. As we'll see, your gender identity is also supposed to be what makes you a woman or a man. It's supposed to be in your head. And sometimes you have discussions about sex as between your legs, as if sex is between your legs, gender identity is in your head. Intersex people are used very politically in this area to suggest, as we'll see, that sex is a spectrum, it's not a binary. And we've also got gender expression, so it's all quite complicated all of a sudden. Now, I don't agree with the activists' conception of gender identity. I think it's better to understand gender identity as a strong psychological identification with an ideal of femininity or masculinity or androgyny. So it's something psychological. We don't all have one. Some people do strongly identify with the opposite sex or really want to be the opposite sex. You know, we're in the realm of desire. It's not necessarily permanent. It can change. It's certainly not innate. I don't think there's any good evidence to think gender identity is innate, and I've looked. And not everyone has a gender identity. Some people do, and then some people make decisions to transition medically and live as the opposite sex or as non-binary. So why I'm telling you all this is to try and explain the background to these increasing political demands that are made in the name of gender identity in many countries now. So you will find activists saying that your recognition of your gender identity is a human right. So as soon as someone says, I feel like a woman, as soon as a male says, I feel like a woman, there is a right for that inner feeling to be recognized by the state, to be put on their passport, to be given every kind of legal accommodation. And this is the idea of what's called self-ID. So in many countries, there's political pressure to allow people to legally change their sex simply on the basis of a declaration of an incongruent gender identity. And that's already the case in Canada, New Zealand, Malta, Ireland, several US states. But there's also strong political pressure to do this in other countries, including in Britain. that's not the only area in which gender identity is making inroads into legal systems. So in Canada, gender identity has been added as a protected characteristic in the Human Rights Act. In the US, Biden has released an executive order which urges that gender identity or discrimination on the grounds of gender identity be treated as a kind of sex discrimination. In the UK, if you commit a crime against someone because of their gender identity, you can get enhanced sentencing as a hate crime. And there's also a big discussion around what's called conversion therapy. In New Zealand, they have criminalized conversion therapy around gender identity, which, as I'll explain, effectively means that you cannot really have a talking therapy for people who feel that their gender identity doesn't match their sex, because that is now criminalized. So I think all of this might seem quite surprising to people who have got no idea how this happened, particularly because the demands being made seem so extreme. But I think, and I've written a book trying to explain partly how we got here. Partly it's a confusion around the word gender, which is an English word that that does many different things and is very ambiguous. But traditionally in the English language, gender was a polite word for biological sex, being male or female. In the 1960s and 70s, radical feminists and second wave feminists started to use the word gender to mean the social and cultural meanings of sex, masculinity, femininity, with the idea that those can change from culture to culture and are fluid. Also in the 1960s, there were a bunch of psychologists working with what were then called intersex children, now would be called children with differences of sexual development or variations of sexual development. And these psychologists started talking about gender roles, meaning acting as a woman, so as a woman is socially expected to act, or acting as a man is socially expected to act. And then they started talking about gender identity, the kind of inner feeling that a particular role fits you or doesn't fit you. So some men have, don't feel that masculinity particularly fits them. Some women don't feel that femininity fits them. And although that discussion started with people with differences of sexual development, it then was extended out to transsexuals and eventually to everybody. So it was assumed, it's now assumed by some that we've all got a gender identity. Some of us, the gender identity fits with our sex, and for others, the gender identity doesn't fit with our sex. But in the 21st century, this new idea arrived that your inner gender identity is what really makes you a woman or a man. So not your sex, not even your gender expression, but your inner feeling of whether your identity fits with the facts about your biology. And this is the bit that becomes really very controversial as soon as people try to implement it in law. So on this new view, a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman. A man is anyone who identifies as a man. Meanwhile, within the category of women, according to this picture, you have two kinds of women. You have what are called cis women, SIS. Those are women whose gender identity fits with what the activists would say was the sex assigned to them at birth. And then there are trans women whose gender identity does not fit with the sex assigned to them at birth because they were assigned male. So that's a complete taxonomical revision, obviously, of what we used to understand women. We used to understand women as the adult members of the female sex, and now we're being told that that doesn't work anymore. Women is a new category, a hybrid category composed of males and females who have a particular gender identity. And the same for men, basically. A man is now anyone, a female or a male, who has a male gender identity. There's cis men and there's trans men. And then there are non-binary people who do not identify either as women or men, and so are neither women nor men, according to this crazy view. And it is crazy. Okay. Meanwhile, LGBT activists also attack the idea of biological sex. So it's in their interests to, motivate their position by saying that there are no real categories of male and female. And they do this by saying things like sex is a spectrum and sex is assigned at birth, with the implication that it's almost arbitrary, that doctors don't discover a pre-existing fact, they create a fact or they create a category relatively arbitrarily. Now, I don't think that that's true. I don't think sex is a spectrum. I think it's about as binary as you can get in nature. There are a very, very small number of people who are ambiguous because of genetic chromosomal disorders. But most of the people who are commonly called intersex can easily be categorized as male or female. And there's a very, very, very small number that can't. But the existence of that very small number doesn't really threaten the idea that there's a binary, because biological binaries are always compatible with variation. That's the whole point of biology. So I don't really buy any of those arguments. So just to keep going, so this new taxonomy, the idea that women are now this new category composed of anyone who has the right kind of inner psychological identity, has given activists a political program, basically. Now their aim is to restructure any area where there was a woman-only resource or space has to be restructured, and it's a matter of justice, supposedly. So we've got a whole new program of things to do, according to these activists. We should use preferred pronouns. That is, if I feel like a man, you should call me he and him. You should use the name that I want you to use, and you should never refer to the fact that of my sex under any circumstances. And according to this new program, we should understand sexual orientation differently, because sexual orientation is not about, according to this new vision, it's not about same-sex attraction or opposite-sex attraction. It's about attraction between same gender identities. So this is even, I sometimes think I must be going mad when I have to explain this to people, because it sounds so crazy. But the idea is that if a male identifies as a woman, so is a woman, and that person is then attracted to women, they must be a lesbian. So now you have male lesbians and you have female gay men. Anyway, so that's another aspect of the program, and that has all sorts of ramifications for gay rights. The activists also, as I've said, want to pursue self-ID, so they think that there should be a legal sex change on the basis of gender identity alone. They also demand that we should not separate changing rooms or dormitories or prisons by sex, but by gender identity, and that is happening. So for instance, you now have males in women's prisons. They haven't had surgery, they haven't taken hormones, they've just announced that they are a woman, and they are now in women's prisons, with the results that you might be able to predict from that, because women offenders are on average, much less violent than men. And in fact, there was a case in the news last week of a rape that has taken place in an American prison of a male. The male has raped a female inmate. We should also not separate sports by sex, but by gender identity, or perhaps a reduction in testosterone, but that won't make enough difference. So this is Hannah Mountsie, a male playing with some females, and as you can see, there's a huge physical difference between these two people that is not just the result of extra training. So at puberty, males release testosterone, which produces a kind of musculature and lung size and limb length and twitch muscles and all sorts of physical things that women will not be able to have on average. And there is also a push to collect data about gender identity, not sex. And that is happening too. So we are losing information about women because the category has changed to people who identify as women. So that is a big program. And as I say, I sometimes think when I tell people about this sort of thing, they must think I've gone mad, but I can assure you that it is true. And it is a successful activist program. It has already resulted in many law changes, and political parties are behind it, NGOs and charities are behind it, educational establishments, universities are behind it. So it has influence, this set of ideas. Now, why do LGBT organizations want all this? Firstly, they think it causes distress to trans people or people with sex-incongruent gender identities to hear facts about their sex, or to be excluded from spaces that they think they should belong to, or sporting teams that they think they should belong to. So there's a kind of movement to be kind. The idea is, in fact, that's what women have always been told. You should be kind and let these people into your spaces and resources and changing rooms and so on. There's also a worry about putting trans women specifically in danger by putting them in male spaces. So the idea is that they are specifically in danger if they dress as women or have a feminine presentation, then they shouldn't be in male spaces. And so those are sort of reasons that we might understand and sympathize with, but I actually think also there's a third reason, which is perhaps more cynical, which is that in the countries in which this is, mostly in the countries in which this program is becoming successful, gay rights has already been achieved. So LGBT organizations haven't got much to do. They've got gay marriage in these countries, they've got adoption and so on. So it gives them a whole new area in which they can make their mark. And of course, it brings in money, and it does bring in money. So, just want to talk a little bit about this program as it is relevant to sexual orientation. So as I've said, the idea that your gender identity is what makes you a woman or a man is also supposed to be what makes you a lesbian or a straight heterosexual. And that has resulted in this reframing. Gay men are people with male gender identities attracted to people with male gender identities, and lesbians are people with female gender identities attracted to people with female gender identities. So in a nutshell, males can be lesbians, females can be gay men, and that is a big change. And you can see that this produces a tension. It produces lots of tension, but one of the ways in which it produces a tension is in this discussion about conversion therapy. So conversion therapy historically was understood as something that happened to gay people, and it's something like being forced into a therapeutic or religious process to try and change you back to heterosexuality. So that seems to me to be wrong, and most people, I think of it as wrong and coercive. But the discussion about conversion therapy has now been extended to include gender identity. And the idea is that you shouldn't try and convert someone's gender identity. If you try and talk them out of this, how they feel about identifying as the opposite sex, that's conversion therapy too. So at every level, from the UN down, you will find this discussion of conversion therapy for sexual orientation and gender identity, saying it should be banned. But if you ban The trouble is that, in the population of children and adolescents, there are rising numbers of people, children, saying that they feel like the opposite sex, right? So there's been, I think it's a 1,000% at least increase in the last 10 years, particularly females. So young girls are basically identifying as the opposite sex or as non-binary. And they want hormones. They want puberty blockers. They want medicine to stop the production of their secondary sex characteristics or to develop the opposite sex. So they're demanding medicine, and in many cases, they're getting it. So we have a whole generation of young people now who have taken medicine that has significantly changed their physical characteristics, right? So in order to, and then of course we have another population of what are called detransitioners who have done that and then regretted it because they have reached the age of 25 or 26 and realize they made a mistake, but then they have irrevocable bodily changes. If they're women, their voices have dropped, they have facial hair, they maybe have had double mastectomies to remove their breasts, they might have had hysterectomies to remove their wombs. If they're men, they will have taken cross-sex hormones that will have produced breasts. There's a whole range of significant changes to bodies. So the point with respect to conversion therapy is obviously if somebody is a child or an adolescent is talking about taking drugs to change their bodies, they should have some period of therapy beforehand to at least to discuss whether this is really what they want and to work out whether they're actually gay, because a lot of these children are gay, it turns out, or they're same-sex attracted, and they are misunderstanding their own sexual attraction and thinking it means that they're the opposite sex. So conversion therapy is not conversion therapy for gender identity, it's just therapy to find out whether people are really wanting what they want for the right reasons. And to criminalize that particularly affects gay people perversely because they are disproportionately represented in the population who want to change their sex. So that was just to emphasize that there is this tension there. Okay, so this has become hugely controversial. All of this, people like me are saying there's a number of problems here for women, for children. So, the fact that there are males in women's prisons, the fact that there are males in women's sporting teams. In Britain, if you are a male who commits a crime and you tell the police that you're a woman, it will be recorded as a woman's crime. You can even, I don't know if I say this in my next slide, but no, you can, there have been cases in court where the victim has been forced to describe her male attacker as a woman. The victim has been forced to say she of the man that has attacked her. So things have got completely out of control. There is also the problem that I just mentioned of the permanent medicalization of children and adolescents with sex-incongruent gender identities. This is Kira Bell, who took the government to a judicial review in the UK, basically wanted to prohibit the use of puberty blockers, which is a drug which is used to retard puberty. And so these are detransitioners, people who have taken puberty blockers and perhaps cross-sex hormones as well, and then regret this, but have lost body parts, have lost health and functionality, and are very angry about it. Okay. And then there's also another area of controversy is that lesbians in particular are suffering because as they are no longer understood as a category based on same-sex attraction, so we now have males saying that I'm a lesbian, and even worse, we have LGBT charities who say that it's transphobic, that is, it's bigoted for lesbians like me not to consider male trans women as potential partners because they're lesbians too. So basically, you know, lesbians are being told they should sleep with males because they're lesbians. Now, how this relates to freedom of expression, I think I have to explain all that because I think people will not understand how crazy it is, but it relates to freedom of expression because it's very important to activists to compel, well, there's two areas in which speech is controlled. On the one hand, there's this idea of no debate. There should be no debate about any of this. To debate it is seen as transphobic. That is, even to raise any of these questions must show that you hate trans people, that you are bigoted. It's not true. It's a very effective weapon to shut down discussion. And then there's also the idea that you must use the preferred pronouns of the person. So if you want to be referred to as a she, I must call you she. I have no option on that. So I don't think that any of what I've said is criticism of trans people. I think it's criticism of a set of ideas that have got a cultural grip amongst many people, a lot of them who aren't trans. But any criticism at all of these ideas is presented by activists as transphobic. So Stonewall, this activist organization, defines transphobia as the fear or dislike of someone based on the fact they are trans, including denying their gender identity or refusing to accept it. So according to Stonewall, you know, if I say to a person who wants to join my women's sports team, you're a man, you can't play rugby in my sports team, that's denying their gender identity, so it's transphobic. So any kind of resistance to this set of ideas is described automatically as transphobic, and that is part of the reason that I had to leave my job, because over several years, people were not just students, but colleagues, you know, in other departments, academics generally, were presenting my criticisms, my reasonable criticisms of this set of ideas as transphobic. And ultimately, it resulted in, you know, 100 people on campus holding up posters, setting off flares with my name on them saying that I had to leave my job. I'm not the only one. There are other people that have been forced to resign. There are people losing jobs. There is a big problem with the left-wing press because they will not report any of this properly. They tend to agree that any kind of dissent must be transphobic, and it's causing huge anger on the part of women in particular. So, like I said, there's also this idea that you have to announce your pronouns when you have meetings. We'll sit around and do a pronoun round, like, what is your pronoun? Has it changed since yesterday? You know, there's a lot of pressure to use preferred pronouns in workplaces and schools. There's media guidelines, like I said, reporting guidelines at the BBC and other places too that specify that men who identify as women have to be described as women. All of this is, you know, it's bad from a compelled speech point of view, but it's also bad because sex still exists and sex still makes a social difference. So I refer everybody to the set of points I made, basic, banal points I made at the beginning. Sex still exists. There's still males, there's still females, there's still social effects of pregnancy, of puberty, of biological facts about our species. But the trouble is now, in these countries, we're not able to describe those effects. We're not able to make laws that offset or mitigate negative effects of biology on women and girls in particular. We've lost single-sex changing rooms because we have policies which say any man who feels like a woman can come into this changing room. We have lost single-sex sporting competition. We have lost sex-specific data. and we've lost legal protections for same-sex attracted people in effect. So, and the final problem, I think, is that we can't talk to children and young people about biology anymore because it's become so ideological, and that has terrible consequences too. So, I just want to finish by saying that I think, although since this is a foundation that focuses on liberalism, I think that liberalism has some role to play in generating this issue. You might find that surprising, but I think that at the very least, what we have in gender identity ideology is a misapplication of liberal ideals. So we've got this idea that the body and biology is irrelevant to moral personhood, and that comes really from the 17th century Anglo-American tradition, which, you know, sees rationality as the thing that gives us dignity and basically gives any state political legitimacy if it's been rationally chosen or consented to or contracted. In some liberal traditions, in the left liberal traditions, the goal is equality, but that becomes problematic when it's recognized that, you know, men and women potentially have different needs and different interests based on their sex. And the idea of freedom that is, you know, very important to the liberal tradition, increasingly important to the liberal tradition now, if it isn't constrained or it isn't contextualized, it can just become a kind of meme that, you know, produces this idea that your body is potentially a constraint on your own freedom. So people we see now in the populist version of liberalism saying people should be free to change their bodies any way they want. You know, if I want to get rid of my breasts, I get rid of my breasts. If I want another pair of breasts, I just buy another pair of breasts. So the market and commodification of the body are involved here, and this idea that potentially there's this kind of dualistic picture where your inner self is chafing at the confines of your outer body. Now, I don't think any of that makes sense, but it seems to be implicit in this set of ideas. And the idea of social norms being a constraint on freedom too. So we should break down the social norms around single-sex spaces, for instance, because they are constraint to people who feel that they shouldn't apply to them or something. So, okay, I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor, for this lesson. I think that it was very important to have you here today because I think it was essential because it's rare to listen to such words, so different in respect to what we could say current propaganda affirms. And it's important to have different perception, to have freedom of expression. And I think that today we have just gone out of Plato's cave in a philosophical way. So, I collect some questions. I will switch a bit into the Italian, just for the organization. Ok, allora, passiamo alle domande. Ho segnato Luigi Amati, che può accendere il microfono e farlo direttamente.
Hello, hi, good evening.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, very interesting. My question is related to the fact that I have a 22-year-old daughter living in London for many, many years. I'm Italian, and I have this kind of discussion with her all the time. And of course, the cultural differences of you know, the environment she's embedded into. And as you say, the different environment we are experiencing here in Italy. Also, she's a student at Central St. Martin's. And if you know a little bit the school, you can imagine what kind of discussions they are having. So my question is very simple. How could we, or how could I approach this topic with my daughter, but in general with a 20 years old, without being told that I'm too old to understand? And of course, me going back to her saying this is ageism, just to try to use, you know, another buzzword and to try to show her that I'm keeping myself up to date?
That's a very difficult question, because what you're experiencing there, as you know, is something that many, many parents are experiencing. And I mean, particularly with children who really do want to change their bodies and are convinced that it's transphobic to be told not that they should wait. I don't have a good answer for you. I mean, one of the underpinnings to that idea is that somehow that younger people have a better understanding of these issues than older people. I think if you dig into that, it makes absolutely no sense. So I've met many a progressive who says, yeah, oh, but the young people, they just understand something here that we don't. Things are changing. It's, you know, we're just old, stuck in our ways. But I think that's because they have this idea that gender identity is something scientific that has just been discovered or something. And it's not remotely scientific. It's a culturally produced phenomenon. It will be gone in 100 years' time. There'll be something else, you know. So if you can try and give her a sense of the historical fluidity of culture, I don't know, that might help. But I mean, she's 22, so I don't know if I can help. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. Yeah.
You were able to convince me, actually. So,
Yes.
ok, and then also abbiamo anche Riccardo Almerighi, che può accendere il microfono e fare la seconda domanda.
Yes, hello, nice to meet you, and thank you for the very interesting presentation. I just have a question related to how in the most liberal country this kind of gender identity is considered by the lawyers. For example, it's quite easy to make a law based on biological differences, okay, male and female, which is also easy to applicate in real. But gender identity is something that we decide and we can change in every moment. So this is not something which is based and decided from the kind of fixed rule. I mean, I don't know if I'm able to understand to explain. So the question is how in these countries the lawyers deal with such kind of individual decision about gender identity. I mean, someone can decide one day that is lesbian or gay or whatever, and the day after it can change. And then how can they fix this problem? Thank you.
That is a very good question. I think it is inoperable, in fact, and I assume that the reason that that the problems have yet to properly come to light is that most of these laws are quite new. But yes, absolutely, it's an unverifiable proposition. It refers to a completely inner state that it is admitted may not be expressed through behavior at all. You know, because the idea is you might be closeted, your gender identity is hidden for political reasons, so you don't tell anybody. But still, as soon as you say it, as soon as you declare, I have a male gender identity, you have to be believed. There's nothing anyone could say to show that you didn't have that identity, because it's entirely inside. So, I mean, there was a case in Canada a couple of years ago. This person who was originally called Jonathan Yaniv, and then I think became Jessica Yaniv, tried to sue some women, like I think that they're called aestheticians, but basically masseuses and people that provided cosmetic procedures that would provide intimate cosmetic procedures to women. So they were women whose job was to go to women's homes and, you know, do intimate kind of cosmetic procedures there. And this Jonathan Yaniv sued these women because they wouldn't. He's an unsurgically unaltered male, they wouldn't do these procedures on him because they didn't want to do that on men, and that's not what they did. And they said they weren't trained for it. And he tried to sue them for discrimination. He put some of them out of business in the process. And eventually he lost his case, but I seem to remember that it was on, you know, kind of almost arbitrary grounds, like they said he'd been racist. They tried to find other reasons, because really once he said he's a woman, according to Canadian law, he is a woman, and there's just nothing, that you can say to disprove that. So you have to find other reasons why he must be a untrustworthy character. I mean, I'm not using his preferred pronouns because I'd like to be clear about his sex, but so yeah, I think that's a big problem, but nobody seems to have thought any of this through.
Thank you.
Okay, so participants are in fibrillation. There's another question for you. Alessandro Gallo può aprire il microfono e fare la domanda. Grazie.
Sì, grazie. Good evening. I want to get back to really the beginning of your presentation when you use several times the word trans in declined in different ways. Do you hear me well?
I do, but which word, sorry?
The trans. You talk about transgender, trans identity,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
the word trans. And I hope you allowed me to switch for a moment the subject and to talk about another subject, about urbanism and toponymy. Because, of course, you are not from Rome, you are now visiting Rome, and you might know that there is an area in Rome called Trastevere, which literally means on the other side of the river Tiber. And it's called like that because was not part of the city center of the city. The people that used to live there were, let's say, a kind of second-class citizens. Even different rules applied over there. But if you go nowadays in Trastevere, and actually, literally, you are now in Trastevere because the Fondazione Einaudi is in the other side of the river compared to the old city of Rome, and you are in Trastevere. But you do not perceive this anymore because nowadays the Trastevere, the area, is extremely hectic, has lots of vibes, full of restaurants, cultures, churches, and everything. You do not perceive anymore the meaning, the origin meaning Trastevere. And this has been changed, not because at a certain moment in history, the people of Rome or the Italians has to make something equal, but for a simple reason. After the unification of Italy, the city of Rome was so small and has to be enlarged, and also had to go outside the core that used to be up to that time. Mm-hmm. I want to get back now to the topic you are dealing tonight. What's your opinion about how we should talk this issue? Do you think it's a more that requires a specific fight on the gender identity, the meaning of trans and so on? So to have a specific fight on these, or you think it's changing that will apply in history, exactly like happened in the urbanism of the city of Rome with the area Trastevere? In other words, do you think that we need to put our attention on a specific fight on the creating law, on legislation, or rather we have to fight on the liberal values, where therefore there will be an implication also on the gender identity, gender issues, and so on?
Okay, well, the immediate impetus for my intervention in any of this is because women and children and lesbians are losing their rights now, right, concretely. So it's not very intellectual. It's like, this is an emergency. Feminism produced these gains for women politically and legally, and they are being removed under the idea of gender identity. So there's a direct conflict. So that's my impetus. And that's where I got in. And it's only after that I started to think about the bigger complications and the relationship to liberalism. But I mean, I'm not convinced that liberalism is going to help. If it depends what you mean by liberalism, obviously. But if you mean a kind of hollowed out version of everyone should be free to pursue their own private good. You know, an action is only bad when it harms someone else, but harm is construed very thinly as taking away their freedom. I'm not sure that's going to be enough to see off this issue, because it seems to ignore all the kind of the parts of this that are not really understood in terms of rights, but are really understood in terms of welfare, or something like sex-based welfare. Like, I think there's such a thing as women's needs that isn't going to collapse into human rights. So I think what this has actually done is expose that liberalism couldn't really accommodate sex-based needs under its traditional framing. So maybe we can reconstruct liberalism to sort that out, maybe not, I just don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, I collect another question. I will do it for you. I read it here. Davide Campanella asks to you, what do you think about, oh, okay, I got it. Okay, do you think that this kind of gender identity theory is like substituting the concept of the body of Foucault? Basically, about
sì, posso... buonasera.
Dimmi. No,
Potevo
avanza
anche
pure.
formularla se... Ah, ok.
Okay.
Perfetto,
Yeah,
grazie.
about the fact that, of course, the Foucault was
Yes,
put a focus on the body, on the coercive power of the state on the body. You should remember the panopticon prison and all this kind of philosophical stuff. And so it was asking to you basically if this concept is going away because of the because of the substitution with the gender identity nowadays.
I think the populist gender identity ideology has many strands. Okay, it has a kind of essentialist kind of basis, but it also has an academic influence through Foucault and through Judith Butler, who took herself to be working in the tradition of Foucault. And I'm not a Foucault scholar, but as Butler interprets Foucault and others, sex itself is a social construct. So they don't think that there's anything they don't think there's anything that isn't a social construct. I mean, I don't think Butler thinks there's anything really that we could meaningfully speak about or understand or think about that isn't socially constructed, including biology. So she talks about biology being a fiction. So that is in here, coming through universities, coming through gender studies departments, who say that, you know, in a sense, they understand the discourse around biological sex as normative, as entirely normative, not descriptive, and also as an operation of power. And so they suggest that we should fight the power, as it were, fight these norms, which are exclusionary, by fucking them up, basically, by men dressing as women and saying they're women, and women dressing as men and saying they're men, and drag and creative performance, which they think will, you know, could potentially unpick biology itself, because biology was never something natural in the first place. Okay, so it's a view. I think it's terribly wrong. I think it's metaphysically wrong. I think that I don't deny that there is a huge cultural production around sex, but I don't think sex is socially constructed, because I don't understand what that would mean to say it was. And I don't think that talking about the differences between men and women is inherently exclusionary in a politically bad way. You know, so I differ in all those sorts of issues. But I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think Foucault is definitely here.
Davide Di Sotto.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So there's another question from Alberto Leo. It's written right here. I can read it for you. Don't you think that all the matter is related to a quest for identity that perhaps is the consequence of a culture that divide masculine and feminine rules in our society? Thus, to work on this level, we can slow down and all these fights. For example, in companies, rediscovering the strategic importance female principles, ask soft skills, allow women to better accept their role, and to stop to imitate men attitudes and behaviors.
Okay, give me a second.
Well, yes, of course.
I mean, I don't know. In your question, you mentioned roles, and women should accept their role. Now, obviously, that can be interpreted in a quite strong way or a relatively weak way. I mean, I don't think that there's such a thing as kind of very fixed normative roles for women and for men. I think that there are things we can say about biology and its relation to the social world, but obviously there are conservatives who would say that women should stay at home and have lots of babies and with men, have relationships with men. And I'm not a conservative in that sense. I don't believe in gender roles in that sense. I do think, though, your starts by saying, do you think that this is all related to a quest for identity? I mean, yes, I do. I think it's also related to a desire to belong, weirdly. I mean, I think as society fractures, as we go more online, as we are less in community with each other and less located in the natural world, it allows these kind of fantasy, neurotic versions of identity to emerge. And in a way, it is a quest for belonging. So I think there's a way of understanding it, which, we can be sympathetic to people who say that they want you to validate their identity, but it doesn't mean that we should do that by the law. There's other ways to meet that need, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor. There's another question from Davide Campanella. If you wanna, you can, Davide, se vuoi puoi accendere il microfono o la farò io direttamente, come preferisci.
Allora, good evening, Professor. I have a simple question. Since gender identity is an ideological construct, do you think it has its origins in an intellectual mistake, an intellectual error, or it's been pushed for political and economic reasons? Thank you.
Both. I think it's a series of intellectual errors. I mean, I think I should be clear that I think it's probably in every society there are people who strongly identify psychologically with the opposite sex. I do understand that. I just don't take all the consequences that are taken to follow from that. And as I say, I think the prioritization of gender identity over sex is an intellectual mistake and a practical mistake. But it also fits with economic interests. There's a huge economic interest in commodifying the body, in surgically altering the body, in medicalizing, in pharmacy. There are surgeons in the US now who advertise double mastectomies for teenagers on TikTok. You can pay to have your breasts cut off aged 17 or 18, and TikTok will be the way you find your surgeon. So there is a huge market here, potentially. Of course, because we are told, hundreds of genders. I mean, I've only talked about male and female, but there's also, and there's non-binary, and then there's, I always forget all the others, but there's lots of, asexuality is now presented as an identity. So if you're not having sex, congratulations, you are now an asexual and you have your own identity. And every time that these new identities are generated, there are opportunities to market these identities. And of course, the trouble is, as we know from philosophers like Ian Hacking, you know, the political or symbolic representation of these identities draws more people in, especially young people. So the more that we talk about these identities, the bigger the group grows. So it's a self-generating mechanism.
Okay, thanks a lot, Professor.
Thank you.
There are some questions here. Nothing. Okay. Oh, okay. There's Alberto Aleo voleva chiarire alcuni aspetti, lo può fare, può accendere il microfono. The question that you answered before. Okay, ideas.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you very much for your lesson. I want to clarify something, because what I meant with roles, women roles, I meant that in the company, in corporation, usually there are some roles, for example, sales director or managing role or executive roles. They are peculiar, they are shaped on male principle, on hard skills. Today, in the corporation, we rediscovered the female principle, aka the soft skills. So women now are accepting the idea that they can act like women to become an executive, to become vice president. So this idea to imitate, to act like men, to have a career in corporation is getting old. So that was the result of working on female principle or soft skill, if you want. So my question was, this could be a key to overcome the problem also in our society.
How?
I don't know. This is my question.
I don't see how. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't think I understand. I still don't think I quite understand. I mean, when you say hard skills and soft skills, okay, that's a very, that's a culturally infused way of talking about it. The women have the soft skills, the men have the hard skills, you know? So I don't know.
I mean that, for example, empathy, listening, the capacity to relate in a certain way, they are now a strategic tools that is recognized, officially recognized in every company. On the other hand, usually in previous time, the idea of hard skills, hard competence, and a very strong attitude, a very powerful mood was the key to achieve success. Now things are changed, so women, they are able to become themselves without changing their attitude towards a masculine way, and they can have a brilliant career. So the idea, my question was to change the culture, can change this fight, this quest for sex or for gender diversity.
I think now I understand your question better. I don't share your optimism, I'm afraid, and partly this is because in the UK, it's my experience that the people who are perversely at the bureaucratic level, the people who are most influential in pushing gender identity ideology are women. So women dominate, I would say, the charities, the non-governmental organizations that are pushing this. It's all about empathy and caring and soft skills and listening. It's not necessarily about understanding, but it's about the performance of very kind of caring personas. So like I said, there are multiple strains going into this problem, and one of them is this kind of feminized kindness. We should all be kind, we should accept, we should be inclusive. All the language is very soft. The upshot is women are losing their legal rights, but it's been done under the guise of this very empathic kind of persona. So I'm skeptical that that's going to help, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have ended questions online.
Okay.
If no one has question right there, okay. Maybe just a conclusion. Listening to you, I was wondering about what will be the future of our society with this kind of categorization. Radical, probably, categorization. What do you think it will happen in the future? What is the direction, basically? In about 20, 30 years, I mean, like in a theoretical, not practical, of course.
So I think there's one reason to be slightly optimistic about the problem of what's happening with children and young people is that countries are increasingly, the health systems are waking up to this issue. So for instance, the National Health Service has a review on, at the moment, of children's treatment in gender identity clinics, they're called. And Sweden was at the forefront of administering puberty blockers to children, and now it is, I believe, stopped. So officially, so there's an evidence base is now growing that shows the harm that this can potentially do. Because, you know, if you stop someone's puberty, I mean, nobody really knows what that means, but there is evidence that it can affect your bone density, your kidneys, your height, obviously, lots of things that are not necessarily understood. So the reason for optimism there is that medicine and all the methodologies of medicine will hopefully start to be applied to stop children being given drugs inappropriately. However, when it comes to males in women's prison, does anybody care? I don't know. I mean, I care, and lots of people I know care, but the government don't seem to care. Judicial systems don't seem to care. So there are whole bunches of women who are, because the people that suffer here are the people that are socioeconomically disadvantaged. You know, the people that women that have to use public space, women that don't have private fancy gyms, or, you know, they are the ones that are being exposed to the decisions of bourgeois academics and lawmakers. So, you know, I don't know what's going to happen to them, because it will take a kind of popular revolt. And the trouble is, a popular revolt may well go wrong. For gay people, you know, there's going to be a backlash. This is being pursued so radically that there will be, the danger is there will be a backlash that will affect gay people and roll back their rights too. So I'm pessimistic in that respect.
Ok, so grazie mille per tutti coloro che hanno ascoltato. È stata una lezione ricca di domande, soprattutto online, che di solito generally questions are more in presence than online, but today is switch. Grazie davvero per l'ascolto, è stato un piacere ospitare la professoressa Stock. Ci vedremo giovedì prossimo. La prossima lezione sarà con Martina della con il professor Gian Cristiano Desiderio in italiano, e poi Martina da Blaiova il giovedì successivo sempre in italiano, e la lezione conclusiva con il professore Infantino. Grazie e buona serata a tutti.
Grazie, arrivederci.